What if World War I never broke out? The First World War, breaking out in 1914 over the assassination of the Austrian Archduke by a Serb in Sarajevo and ending in 1918 with the surrender of Germany, would be, with 17 million deaths, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, and be the defining moment of the 20th century, as it would lead to the Second World War and Cold War. But what if that didn't happen? What if World War I never broke out? In this timeline, after Serbia agreed to most Austrian demands, Germany puts a firm foot and demands from Austria-Hungary to agree to it, as they wouldn't support them in a war against Russia anymore. And so Austria-Hungary and Serbia make peace, and the world breathes a huge sigh of relief, though this did damage Austro-German relations. By October 1914, Portugal still struggles to pay off its debt to Germany and UK. And so Germany and UK come up with a plan to take Portuguese colonies as compensation. UK gets Cabo Verde, Guinea, Mozambique, Goa and Macau, while Germany gets São Tomé, Cabinda, Angola and East Timor. And so in October 1914, Anglo-German forces invade Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia. Meanwhile, France protests against this, as they don't want Germany, and to a lesser degree UK, get too powerful, and so UK and Germany offer Guinea and Cabinda, which means they too join the invasion. After less than a month, Portugal lost all of its colonies to the coalition. This causes Portugal to be internationally isolated, and a civil war between monarchists and republicans breaks out, and Spain uses the opportunity to invade and annex Portugal. As the Hejaz Railway is nearing its destination of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali knows he has to rise up now, or else there is no chance of an independent Arab state, and so in 1916 the Arab revolt breaks out. While they have their generals who died in Gallipoli in this timeline, one also has to consider that the Ottomans don't have to fight Russia and UK, and the Arabs don't get British support, and so the revolt is quickly crushed and law and order is restored in Hejaz. Hussein, his family and his co-belligerents are executed, and in 1918 the railway reaches Mecca. Since there is no Great War in Europe, Woodrow Wilson loses the 1916 United States presidential election to Charles Evans Hughes, who wins re-election in 1920. In 1924, Hiram Johnson of the Republican Party is elected president, and he wins re-election in 1928. The Great Depression still hits, but with Herbert Hoover not president it is much milder, and by 1932 its effects are almost gone. In 1932, Republican Quentin Roosevelt, who is the son of Theodore Roosevelt, wins the election against Democratic Al Smith. The Democrats didn't nominate FDR, as the Republicans already nominated a Roosevelt. He then got re-elected in 1936. Wendell Willkie then wins in 1940, only for the Speaker of the House Joseph Martin to end his term and run in 1944. By 1948 the Democrats haven't won for 88 years now, bearing Cleveland and Wilson, and it was actually the Progressive Party under Henry A. Wallace that was rivaling the Republican Party, and though they lost against Thomas E. Dewey in 1948, Henry A. Wallace won in 1952 and 1956. In 1960 and 1964 Richard Nixon won, and in 1968 and 1972 RFK won, who passes the Civil Rights Act of 1970. In 1976 Benjamin M. Spock is elected president, only to lose to Ronald Reagan in 1980. In 1984 he is re-elected, and in 1988 his vice president George H. W. Bush is elected, and in 1992 and 1996 Bernie Sanders is elected. In 2000 and 2004 George W. Bush is elected, and in 2008 and 2012 Jonathan Jackson becomes president. In 2016 John Kasich becomes president, and in 2020 Raul Grijalva becomes president. Unlike in our own timeline, the Southern strategy doesn't happen, and the GOP isn't conservative, but rather market liberal. Conservatives still become a faction, as there is no other right-wing party, but they aren't bigger than the Freedom Caucus in our own timeline. In 1916 Franz Josef I dies, and Charles I becomes Emperor of Austria-Hungary. He realizes that the empire is at a breaking point, and so plans to federalize it to a United States of Greater Austria. Talks with Hungary, which opposed such a federalization, went nowhere, and in February 1920 Hungary declared independence, starting the Austro-Hungarian Civil War. But thanks to heavy German support and uprisings by Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, and Croats, Hungary was defeated, and the United States of Greater Austria was formed. However, this angered Hungarian nationalists, and so on April 1, 1922 a Hungarian assassinated Charles I in a trip to Budapest like Franz Ferdinand was just 8 years ago. His 10-year-old son Otto is crowned as Otto I, but a regency led by his mother Zita is in charge for the next 8 years. In 1917, after the failed Arab revolt, the Kuwait Treaty was signed with the UK and Ottoman Empire, in which they finalized their new border. The Ottoman Empire takes Kuwait, which definitely won't have huge oil deposits in the future, and the UK gets Rub al-Khali, which was officially under Ottoman jurisdiction. The Ottomans then helped Jebel Shamr to take down the Emirate of Nejd and Hissa, with Jebel Shamr taking Nejd, and the Ottoman Empire taking Hissa. In Iran, without World War I taking place on its soil, the Qajars aren't weakened and the Pahlavis never rise to power, which also means Iran is a constitutional monarchy, as was the case under the Qajars ever since 1906. In China, with the nation collapsing during the warlord period, the European powers begin to partition it. Russia annexes Jiangsu and Ningxia, Gansu, Qinghai and Xinjiang. Germany establishes a colony in Shandong. France extends French Indochina to the Pearl and Yangtze River. Japan puppets Manchuria under Zhang Zhaolin, and the UK establishes a protectorate in Tibet under Thubten Gyatso. The rest was a mere vassal of these 5 nations, only to be later further partitioned into 5 vassal states. The Russian vassal in Shaanxi and Sichuan was led by Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich as the United Duchies of Shaanxi and Sichuan. In Hebei and Shaanxi, Japan establishes the Beijing Governorate under the Dog-Meat General. North of the Yangtze, Germany restores the Qing dynasty. France establishes the Republic of Hunan under Chen Jianming, and the United Kingdom establishes the United Kingdom of the 5 provinces under Henry I, Duke of Gloucester, with the coastal cities becoming an international zone based around Shanghai. In Europe, Russia would steadily grow in the 20s and 30s, and after a schism with the other Entente members in Paris and London, leaves the faction and becomes a third faction in the European continent. Meanwhile, both communism and fascism never rise in Europe. In 1926, Mehmet VI dies, and Abdülmecid II becomes Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, and the FAP overthrow the 3 pashas and restore democracy. The Grand Vizier becomes an elected position, with Mustafa Kemal of the Ottoman People's Party becoming its first Grand Vizier. In 1941, Wilhelm II dies and Wilhelm III becomes Kaiser, and he would cool down the tensions in Europe his father left behind. It was under him when Germany developed its first nuclear weapon in the deserts of Namibia, soon followed by the UK, Russia, USA, France, Japan, Austria, and maybe the Ottoman Empire and Italy. In 1951, Wilhelm III dies and Wilhelm IV becomes Kaiser. In 1959, Cuba still is ruled by Fidel Castro, but here communism just doesn't exist, and he may not even declare himself to be communist, as this ideology just doesn't exist. Decolonization strikes much later, and first really begins in 1970 when Indochina rose up against France, and in the end the Indochinese Federation becomes independent under Ngo Dinh Diem. They and many other East and Southeast Asian colonies would join the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Decolonization would also strike in Africa, and in the 1980s many African colonies gain independence from UK and France, with the only exceptions being Algeria and Djibouti for France and southern Rhodesia, Bechuanaland, Lesotho and Swaziland for UK. Italy has to give Eritrea and Somalia independence at one point, but keeps Libya, as with more and more Italian immigrants coming in they become the majority. Though the desert further away from the sea aren't really under Italian control. Spain still keeps holding on Western Sahara, and Guinea and Belgium was forced to give Congo independence, but then the Congo crisis broke out between pro-Belgian and anti-Belgian forces, and German-supported Katanga rebels. In the end the pro-Belgian forces won, but Katanga became independent, and since it is closely linked to Germany, it works as a connection between Southwest Africa and Ostafrika. Speaking about the devil. In 1984, 100 years after the Berlin Conference, the people of Ostafrika rebel against their colonial overlord, and after years of fighting, the Dar es Salaam Accords are signed in 1991. Tanganyika in modern-day Tanzania, bearing Zanzibar, Burundi and Rwanda, becomes independent, but with a few caveats. They have to keep Wilhelm IV as emperor, join the Kaiserlich Bund or Imperial Alliance, which is basically the German Commonwealth, and they have to use the Afrika Mark, which is 1-to-1 to the Reichsmark. Though this wasn't in the treaty itself, Germany kept a lot of influence in the nation itself, and coup any unfriendly regime like France. Soon later Cameroon and Togoland become independent with the same conditions, followed by New Guinea and Shandong, with these two using the Austrasian mark, which is also 1-to-1 to the Reichsmark. There was however one colony they refused to give up, and that was Zuidwest-Afrika, and so from the 1980s to the late 1990s they fight the Zuidwest-Afrika Krieg against the Namibian Swavo and Angolan Vbiba and Nuvua. In 2003 a peace agreement was signed between the Nuvua and Germans in Tumbua. The Republic of Angola becomes independent, but with the same caveats as before. They also help them take down the Vbiba. Algeria also gets lands in northern Namibia, namely its Panhandle and Ovambaland, reducing its native population by half. In Namibia, Germany encouraged Germans to settle, and before the war there were 2.5 million Germans in Zuidwest-Afrika, which is equal to its native population, but now with Ovambaland and its Panhandle lost, Germans make up 2/3 of the population, and they continue rasentering or segregation against the natives. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s this becomes a hot topic in Zuidwest-Afrika, and in 2008 retired Oberstleutnant of the Zuidwest-African Air Force Wolfgang Schenk stated, "Rasentering heute, Rasentering morgen and Rasentering für immer," or segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. In 2018 Zuidwest-Afrika became a German Bundesland under Reichskanzler Angela Merkel, which caused the former colony to adopt German law, including an end of segregation. Since she was from the Conservative Center Party, many conservatives switched to the nationalist DKP. This caused the right vote to be split, with them becoming fourth and third respectively, and the Social Democratic SPD to win. They form a coalition with the Swavo. In 2022 many DKP voters switched back to the center, who became second. The governing coalition was forced to invite the Greens, who became sixth. The remaining German colonies, namely its Pacific Islands and Sancti Thomas and Prince, modern-day São Tomé and Principe, are elevated to overseas territories. When the United Kingdom left Cyprus, Egypt, and Sudan, they were returned to the Ottoman Empire, as they were just occupied by the British. The Ottoman Empire annexes Cyprus and puppets the Khedivate of Egypt, which is in a personal union with the Ottoman Empire, as Sultan Abbas I of the Ottoman Empire is also Khedive Abbas III of the Khedivate of Egypt. In 2011 the Arabs rise up against their Ottoman overlord as part of the Arab Spring. This uprising would be known as the Second Arab Revolt. And though it was more successful than their last attempt, in the end the Ottoman managed to crush the revolt by 2015. During this time the Egyptians couped the government and declared the Republic of Egypt. After the war the Ottoman Empire is transformed into the Ottoman Federation, which gives all of its citizens, both Turks and not Turks, both Muslims and non-Muslims, equal rights. In 2019 they would also legalize same-sex marriage. Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Mauritania, Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar and Bahrain would form the Arab League, with their goal being to liberate the Arabs under Spanish, French, Italian and Ottoman rule. With communism not existing, monarchies in the Balkans, Afghanistan, or Ethiopia are never overthrown. Norway, UK, Australia, New Zealand and France still partition Antarctica, and without UK being distracted by World War II, Chile and Argentina don't have the momentum to put up their own claims. The remaining part of Antarctica is claimed by Germany. In this timeline Europe would be at a decadent peace, and with the development of nukes a war could bring total destruction to the world. This timeline also causes major changes in Africa and Asia, and minor ones in Oceania and Antarctica, though like always the Americas don't change. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.